The easiest way to lose your soul is to keep something that was never yours. The words echoed quietly through Daniel Brooks's mind as he bent down in the corner of a crowded supermarket parking lot and picked up a dark brown leather wallet lying beside a shopping cart. Cars rolled past without slowing, shopping bags rustled beneath a cool autumn breeze, and people hurried toward their next appointment without ever noticing what had just happened. Daniel turned the wallet over in his calloused hands, expecting to find a few dollars and perhaps a driver's license. Instead, the moment he carefully opened it, his breathing almost stopped. Crisp stacks of $100 bills filled one side. A quick glance told him there had to be nearly $40,000 inside. For a man who counted every gallon of gasoline before payday and compared grocery prices down to the last dollar, it was more money than he had held in his hands in years. A middle-aged man loading groceries into a luxury sport utility vehicle noticed Daniel staring into the wallet. He walked over with a knowing grin and lowered his voice. "Nobody saw you pick it up," he said. "Keep it. Whoever lost that kind of money will never even miss it." Daniel looked down once more, but it was not the cash that caught his attention. Tucked inside a transparent pocket rested a small, slightly worn photograph of a smiling elderly man with his arm around a little girl. Folded behind the photograph was an envelope with faded handwriting that read, "Dad's last letter." Daniel gently closed the wallet. "Someone will miss this," he answered quietly. The stranger laughed, shook his head, and drove away, convinced he had just witnessed the world's biggest mistake. Daniel slipped the wallet safely inside his jacket instead of his backpack, almost as if protecting something fragile. He was not protecting the money. He was protecting someone's memories. His old pickup truck coughed to life after the second turn of the key. The dashboard displayed a fuel warning light that had been glowing since yesterday. He smiled to himself. Emma would probably remind him again that the truck deserved a nicer retirement than endless trips across town. Thinking about his 8-year-old daughter softened the weight of another long workday waiting at the neighborhood repair garage. She had inherited her late mother's habit of believing every person deserved kindness before judgment. Daniel often wondered whether he was teaching Emma to become strong, or whether she was quietly teaching him not to become tired of doing the right thing. He searched through the wallet carefully until he found a driver's license. Charlotte Bennett. The address belonged to an upscale neighborhood nearly 20 miles away. It would make him late for work. It would waste the little fuel he had left. It would almost certainly mean skipping lunch to make up the lost time. None of those thoughts changed his decision. Morning sunlight broke through gray clouds as Daniel pulled away from the parking lot, carrying a fortune that could have erased many of his own worries. Yet every mile he drove made one thing increasingly clear. Money could solve problems, but character decided which problems a person chose to solve. Somewhere across the city, Charlotte Bennett had not yet realized she had lost far more than a wallet, and before the day reached its end, one quiet act of honesty would begin changing 2 lives in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. Daniel Brooks arrived at Harper Auto Repair nearly 45 minutes later than usual, but he did not regret a single mile of the extra drive. The old pickup truck rattled into the familiar parking space as the morning sun climbed above the rooftops, casting long beams of light across rows of aging vehicles waiting for repairs. He stepped out carrying his worn metal toolbox in one hand and carefully slipped the leather wallet into the small locker beside his workbench before beginning the day. He refused to leave something so valuable unattended until he could personally return it. Running late today, his longtime co-worker, Mike Dawson, called with a grin while tightening the lug nuts on a family sedan. Daniel smiled apologetically. "I had something important to take care of." Mike shrugged. "Around here, everything is important except our paychecks." The two men laughed quietly before the familiar rhythm of another workday settled in. Air compressors hissed. Impact wrenches echoed across the garage. The scent of motor oil mixed with fresh coffee drifting from the small break room. Daniel moved from one repair to another with steady hands, never rushing even when customers grew impatient. Every bolt mattered. Every brake line mattered. Every family trusting him with their vehicle mattered. Shortly before noon, his phone vibrated inside his pocket. The screen displayed a photograph of an 8-year-old girl missing her front tooth and smiling as though every ordinary day was a celebration. Daniel answered immediately. "Hi, sweetheart." Emma's cheerful voice filled the line. "Daddy, Did you remember your lunch today? Daniel looked toward the empty passenger seat of his truck through the open garage door and smiled sheepishly. I remembered everything except the lunch. Emma giggled. I knew it. Mrs. Jenkins packed an extra peanut butter sandwich this morning because she said you always forget when you worry too much. Daniel laughed softly. Please tell Mrs. Jenkins that she keeps saving me from myself. Emma became quiet for a moment before asking, Are you coming to my school reading night tomorrow? Daniel did not hesitate. Nothing could keep me away. Promise. I promise. After hanging up, Daniel reached into his locker for the wallet, intending to call the phone number listed on the emergency contact card tucked inside. Before he could dial, another folded paper slipped free and landed gently on the floor. It was an old handwritten letter, its edges softened by years of careful handling. Daniel immediately picked it up without unfolding it. The faded ink on the envelope still read, Dad's last letter. He carefully placed it back exactly where it belonged. Some memories were never meant for curious eyes. Across town, inside a modern downtown office surrounded by glass walls and polished marble floors, Charlotte Bennett searched frantically through every drawer of her desk, every pocket of her briefcase, and every compartment inside her luxury sedan. Her assistant watched with growing concern. Miss Bennett, we have canceled 3 meetings already. Is it the cash? Charlotte slowly shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. Forget the money. I can replace the money. She closed her eyes, fighting back emotion. But I cannot replace the last letter my father ever wrote to me. At that very moment, less than 20 miles away, Daniel carefully locked the wallet inside his truck before finishing his final repair of the afternoon, unaware that someone else's most precious memory had already become the most important responsibility of his day. Charlotte Bennett sat alone in her corner office long after her assistant had stepped outside to cancel the remaining meetings. The afternoon skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but she barely noticed the city beneath the pale, autumn sunlight. Her hands rested on the polished wooden desk, trembling ever so slightly as she replayed the morning again and again. The cash inside the wallet represented weeks of charitable donations she had planned to deliver personally to several children's programs before the weekend. Losing that money would have been frustrating, but it was not what filled her heart with fear. Carefully opening a small wooden box kept inside her desk, she looked at an old photograph of herself standing beside her father when she was barely 10 years old. He had always carried the same gentle smile, the kind that made every difficult day feel a little less heavy. Before he passed away from a long illness several years earlier, he had written her one final letter. It was not filled with business advice or instructions about the family company. Instead, he wrote about character, reminding her that success meant very little if kindness disappeared along the way. Charlotte had carried that letter inside her wallet every single day since his funeral because reading even a few lines always reminded her of the man she never wanted to disappoint. Now she feared it was gone forever. Her assistant quietly returned. Miss Bennett, security reviewed the surveillance cameras from the shopping center. They saw someone pick up the wallet. Charlotte stood immediately. Who was it? The footage is not very clear, but it appears to be a man driving an older pickup truck. He left before anyone realized the wallet was missing. Charlotte closed her eyes for a brief moment. She had spent years working with financial investigations and corporate negotiations. Experience had taught her that when large amounts of cash disappeared, they almost never returned. Yet something inside her refused to surrender hope. Meanwhile, Daniel finished replacing the brakes on a family station wagon before washing the grease from his hands. As the last customer drove away, he removed the wallet from his truck once again. The driver's license listed a home address, but a business card tucked beside it displayed the headquarters of Bennett Financial Group in downtown Chicago. Daniel glanced at the dashboard clock. If traffic cooperated, he could still reach the office before it closed. Mike noticed him locking the garage. Working another side job? Daniel smiled. No, just trying to finish something I started this morning. Mike laughed. You always have the strangest answers. Daniel climbed into the aging pickup and headed toward downtown with the wallet resting safely on the passenger seat. The fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, but he ignored it. Some journeys mattered more than convenience. As evening shadows stretched across the city streets, Charlotte remained standing beside the office window, quietly whispering the last sentence she could remember from her father's letter. The world changes one honest choice at a time. She never imagined that at that very moment, a man she had never met was driving across the city to prove those words had been true all along. Daniel eased his aging pickup beneath the towering glass entrance of Bennett Financial Group, just as the last golden rays of sunlight reflected across downtown Chicago. Expensive sedans lined the curb while employees hurried toward elevators carrying briefcases and laptop bags, eager to leave another demanding workday behind. Daniel looked down at the worn leather wallet resting on the passenger seat before quietly picking it up. He gently brushed away a trace of dust from its surface as though it belonged to someone he had known for years instead of only a few hours. Inside the lobby, polished marble floors echoed beneath every footstep, while a receptionist looked up with polite curiosity as Daniel approached the front desk, wearing faded work clothes, still carrying the faint scent of motor oil. "May I help you?" she asked kindly. Daniel placed the wallet carefully on the counter without opening it. "I believe this belongs to Miss Charlotte Bennett." The receptionist stared for a moment before quickly lifting the wallet. Her eyes widened almost instantly. "Where did you find this?" "In the supermarket parking lot this morning." She opened the identification pocket, recognized the name, and immediately reached for the telephone. Less than 2 minutes later, the elevator doors opened and Charlotte hurried across the lobby faster than anyone there had ever seen her walk. The confidence that usually surrounded her had been replaced by quiet hope and unmistakable worry. She stopped only a few feet away from Daniel, looking first at the wallet and then at the man standing patiently beside the reception desk. Without saying a word, she opened it with trembling hands. The bundles of cash remained exactly where they had been. She carefully unfolded the envelope marked Dad's last letter. Tears quietly gathered in her eyes before she even looked inside. The paper was still there, untouched, its familiar handwriting exactly as she remembered it. She closed the wallet slowly and drew a long breath that seemed to release an entire day's worth of fear. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what you just returned to me." Daniel smiled gently. "I think I do." Charlotte reached into the wallet, removed several thick bundles of cash, and held them toward him. "Please accept this. It would mean a great deal to me." Daniel politely stepped back and shook his head. "No, thank you." She blinked in surprise. "There is enough here to help your family, repair your truck, and probably pay bills for months." Daniel's expression never changed. "The money was never mine." Charlotte lowered her hand slowly. "At least let me reward your honesty." Daniel glanced briefly toward the letter, resting inside the wallet before meeting her eyes again. "Your father's words are worth far more than anything inside that wallet. I could never put a price on someone else's memories." The lobby fell completely silent. Even the receptionist stopped typing as those simple words settled into the room. Charlotte looked at Daniel as though she had just met someone from a world she had almost forgotten existed. He nodded politely, wished her a peaceful evening, and quietly turned toward the exit before she could think of another way to stop him. Standing beside the glass entrance, Charlotte watched the old pickup disappear into evening traffic, holding the wallet tightly against her heart. For the first time in many years, she realized she was no longer thinking about the money she had recovered. She was thinking about the man who had walked away from it without hesitation, and before the night was over, one question would quietly refuse to leave her heart. Who lives like that anymore? Charlotte barely slept that night. Long after the lights of the city faded beyond the windows of her apartment, she remained seated in the quiet living room with her father's letter resting gently across her lap. She read every line slowly, just as she had done countless times before, yet one sentence refused to leave her thoughts. "The greatest wealth you will ever discover is the character of an ordinary person." As a child, she believed those words described fairy tales. As an adult surrounded by contracts, negotiations, and balance sheets, she had almost forgotten them completely. Then one mechanic in worn work clothes had quietly reminded her that her father had been right all along. Early the next morning, Charlotte arrived at her office carrying only a cup of coffee and a decision she could not fully explain. Her assistant looked up from the day schedule. "Your first meeting begins in 20 minutes. Charlotte gently closed the planner. "Reschedule everything until this afternoon." The assistant looked surprised. "Is something wrong?" Charlotte smiled thoughtfully. "No, I simply need to understand someone." Less than an hour later, her luxury sedan sat discreetly across the street from Harper Auto Repair. She wore a simple sweater and blue jeans instead of her usual tailored business suit, hoping to avoid attracting attention. Through the windshield, she watched Daniel unlock the garage doors before sunrise. He swept the floor before the first customer arrived. He filled the old coffee pot for everyone instead of only himself. When an elderly customer struggled to carry 2 heavy boxes from her trunk, Daniel immediately set aside his own work and carried them inside without being asked. He never looked around to see whether anyone noticed. He simply helped because someone needed help. Charlotte remained quietly inside the car, resisting the urge to walk over and thank him again. She wanted to understand whether yesterday had been an extraordinary moment or simply an ordinary part of his life. By late morning, another customer arrived with an aging minivan that clearly needed expensive repairs. The worried father explained that he had recently lost his job and could only afford the most urgent work. Daniel listened patiently before writing a much smaller estimate than the repair truly required. Mike glanced at the paperwork after the customer walked away. "You know that barely covers the parts," he whispered. Daniel smiled calmly while returning a wrench to its place. His children still need a safe ride to school. Mike shook his head with a familiar grin. "You are never going to get rich doing this." Daniel laughed softly. "That has never been my goal." Charlotte lowered her eyes, feeling something inside her quietly shift. She had spent years measuring success by quarterly reports and investment returns because that was the world she understood. Watching Daniel made her wonder whether another kind of success had been standing in front of her all along. Shortly before noon, a yellow school bus stopped near the garage. Emma stepped off carrying a backpack almost as large as she was. The moment Daniel saw her, the fatigue of another busy morning disappeared from his face, replaced by a smile so genuine that Charlotte found herself smiling too. Emma ran into his arms before excitedly describing a science project she had started at school. Daniel listened as though nothing else in the world mattered. Sitting quietly behind the steering wheel, Charlotte suddenly realized she was no longer following the man who had returned her wallet. She was following a father whose quiet dignity was teaching lessons that no amount of money could ever buy, and she could not shake the feeling that discovering his ordinary life might become the most extraordinary journey she had ever taken. Charlotte returned to the quiet street outside Harper Auto Repair the following evening, just as the last customer drove away beneath a sky painted with shades of orange and deep blue. She had told herself all day that she would stop following Daniel after satisfying her curiosity, yet something stronger than curiosity kept bringing her back. She watched from across the street as he locked the garage, climbed into his aging pickup with Emma beside him, and drove only a few miles before stopping in front of a modest brick house belonging to an elderly widow. The woman greeted them warmly from her porch, waving before Daniel opened the truck bed and carefully removed a small toolbox. Emma carried a paper grocery bag almost as proudly as if she were delivering a great treasure. Charlotte parked farther down the block and quietly observed without drawing attention to herself. Daniel spent nearly an hour repairing a broken porch railing and replacing a loose outdoor light fixture, while Emma sat beside the elderly woman on the porch steps, reading aloud from a library book with cheerful enthusiasm. Laughter drifted softly through the cool evening air as autumn leaves rustled across the sidewalk. When Daniel finished tightening the final screw, the elderly woman reached into her purse and offered him several folded bills. He smiled warmly and gently pushed her hand back. "You already paid me," he said. She looked confused. When Daniel pointed toward Emma, who was now helping carry empty grocery bags toward the recycling bin. "You baked her favorite apple pie last month. I still owe you for that." The elderly woman laughed through grateful tears. "That hardly seems like an even trade." Daniel shrugged with quiet contentment. Kindness almost never keeps score. Charlotte felt an unexpected lump rise in her throat. She had witnessed billion-dollar agreements negotiated in elegant conference rooms, yet this simple exchange carried more humanity than many of those contracts combined. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, Daniel and Emma returned home to a small white house with a weathered front porch and flower boxes that had long since finished blooming for the season. Through the softly glowing kitchen window, Charlotte watched them prepare dinner together. Emma stood on a small wooden step stool stirring tomato soup, while Daniel grilled cheese sandwiches in an old cast-iron skillet. Between cooking and setting the table, they laughed over a spelling test, compared drawings from school, and paused to bow their heads for a quiet prayer before eating. There were no expensive decorations, no grand dining room, and no signs of luxury. Yet the little home radiated a warmth that many mansions never managed to create. Charlotte remained inside her parked car long after the lights inside the house dimmed. For the first time in years, she questioned whether success had quietly convinced her to overlook the simplest forms of happiness. Before driving away, she glanced once more toward the front porch, where Daniel had hung a small wooden sign that read, "Choose kindness every day." The words were plain, almost ordinary, yet they matched the life he lived with remarkable consistency. Charlotte started the engine slowly, carrying home a realization she had never expected to find. The man who had refused $40,000 possessed something infinitely rarer than wealth, and she could no longer ignore the quiet desire to understand the story that had shaped a heart like his. Saturday morning arrived with crisp autumn air and bright blue skies stretching across the neighborhood. Daniel promised Emma they would spend the day exactly the way her mother used to describe as ordinary enough to become unforgettable. After finishing a quick oil change for a longtime customer, he closed the garage early, surprising Mike Dawson, who looked at him with playful disbelief. Leaving before sunset, Mike joked. Daniel smiled while wiping his hands on a clean shop towel. A promise to my daughter is still the most important appointment on my calendar. Emma waited patiently beside the old pickup, swinging her backpack with cheerful excitement. Their first stop was the public library, where Emma eagerly returned a stack of books and carefully selected 3 more. The librarian greeted Daniel by name and quietly handed Emma a small bookmark decorated with colorful autumn leaves. "For one of my favorite readers," she said warmly. Emma's face lit up as though she had received a priceless gift. Charlotte happened to be inside the library meeting with the director about a Literacy Foundation donation. She had not expected to see Daniel there, yet once again she found herself quietly observing from a respectful distance. She watched Emma excitedly tell her father about a story featuring a brave lighthouse keeper who helped strangers find their way home. Daniel listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions instead of checking his phone or rushing toward the exit. Every moment reminded Charlotte that the greatest gift he offered his daughter was not money or expensive experiences. It was his undivided presence. Later that afternoon, they stopped at a small neighborhood park where golden leaves drifted gently across the walking paths. Daniel spread an old quilt beneath a maple tree while Emma unpacked homemade peanut butter sandwiches, apple slices, and 2 reusable water bottles. Their picnic cost almost nothing, yet they laughed together as though they were enjoying a luxury vacation. Emma challenged her father to a game of checkers using a small travel set that had clearly been repaired several times over the years. Daniel intentionally made one obvious mistake, allowing Emma to capture an important piece. She immediately looked at him suspiciously before smiling. "You let me do that?" Daniel laughed. "No, I reminded you to believe in yourself." Charlotte remained seated on a nearby bench with a book open across her lap, though she had not turned a single page in nearly 20 minutes. She noticed how Daniel celebrated every small achievement Emma made, never speaking down to her, never pretending to know everything, always encouraging her to think for herself. As the afternoon sunlight softened into warm shades of amber, Emma rested her head against Daniel's shoulder and quietly asked, "Do you think Mommy would like today?" Daniel looked toward the peaceful sky before answering with gentle certainty. "I think she would tell us we spent our time exactly the right way." Emma smiled contentedly, closing her eyes for a moment as the cool breeze stirred the trees overhead. Charlotte felt tears gathering unexpectedly. She had spent years chasing extraordinary accomplishments while overlooking the quiet beauty hidden inside ordinary afternoons like this one. Driving home that evening, she realized she no longer admired Daniel simply because he had returned her wallet. She admired him because he had built a life where love was measured by time, kindness, and quiet consistency, and she found herself wondering what kind of story could have shaped a man who carried so much grace without ever asking the world to notice. Monday morning arrived beneath low gray clouds as a cool breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through the streets of Chicago. Charlotte walked into her office earlier than usual, but instead of reviewing financial reports, she found herself staring at the framed photograph of her father resting quietly on the bookshelf behind her desk. She remembered something he often said whenever she measured success only by numbers. A person's true wealth appears when no one is watching. At the time, she had smiled politely, without fully understanding. Now those words followed her everywhere she went because they described Daniel Brooks more accurately than any business achievement she had ever witnessed. Unable to ignore the growing questions in her heart, Charlotte quietly asked her assistant to gather only publicly available information about Daniel's professional background. She wanted no invasion of privacy, only enough to understand how a man with such remarkable character had arrived at a modest neighborhood garage. By late afternoon, her assistant returned carrying a small folder. "There is not much," she admitted. "He rarely appears online. No interviews. No awards. No social media." Charlotte opened the folder with quiet curiosity. The first page contained employment records showing that Daniel had once worked for one of the country's leading engineering companies nearly a decade earlier. Another page revealed several patents connected to fuel-efficient engine components. Charlotte looked up in surprise. "These are impressive." Her assistant nodded. Former colleagues described him as one of the company's brightest engineers. Then, 5 years ago, he resigned unexpectedly and never returned to the industry. Charlotte continued reading until she reached the final page. A brief newspaper notice mentioned the passing of Daniel's wife after a tragic traffic accident. No interviews followed. No public statements. Only a quiet resignation and a simple sentence noting that he would be raising his young daughter alone. Charlotte slowly closed the folder, her eyes lingering on the final paragraph. Suddenly, so many ordinary moments she had witnessed made perfect sense. The repaired lunchbox, the aging pickup truck, the long workdays, the patient smile. None of them reflected a lack of ability. They reflected a father who had quietly chosen his daughter over every career opportunity placed before him. That evening, Charlotte drove once more past Harper Auto Repair without intending to stop. The garage lights had already been turned off, but she noticed Daniel and Emma sitting together on folding chairs outside the building, watching the sunset paint the sky with soft shades of orange and purple. Emma held a small astronomy book across her lap while pointing excitedly toward the first evening star. Daniel listened with complete attention before handing her an old pair of binoculars. She laughed with delight as she searched the sky, completely unaware that someone across the street was watching one of the simplest yet most meaningful moments of her childhood unfold. Charlotte remained inside her car, feeling an unexpected mixture of admiration and humility. She had spent years believing that extraordinary people announced themselves through remarkable accomplishments. Daniel revealed something entirely different. Extraordinary people often lived ordinary lives with extraordinary love. As the final light faded beyond the horizon, Charlotte quietly whispered her father's favorite words to herself. "Character is what remains after every title disappears." For the first time in many years, she understood exactly what he had meant, and she realized she could no longer allow Daniel's quiet sacrifice to remain unseen by a world that desperately needed examples of hope. Charlotte spent the next several days thinking less about how she could repay Daniel and more about how she could honor the values he quietly lived every day. Every solution that first came to mind felt wrong. Writing him a large check would only ignore the dignity he had protected by refusing her reward. Offering charity would reduce a man of remarkable character to someone waiting for help, and she knew instinctively that was not who Daniel was. One quiet evening, while reviewing several community investment proposals inside her office, an idea slowly began taking shape. Bennett Financial Group had been searching for a local automotive business to restore and modernize its aging fleet of service vehicles. The company needed a dependable independent repair partner rather than another national chain. Charlotte studied the proposal thoughtfully before smiling to herself. This would not be a favor. It would be an opportunity earned through ability. The following morning, she invited her operations director into the conference room. "I want every qualified neighborhood repair shop evaluated," she said calmly. "Use the same standards for everyone. Experience, customer trust, quality of work, and long-term reliability." The director nodded while making notes. "Do you already have someone in mind?" Charlotte answered honestly. "I have someone I believe deserves a fair chance. Nothing more and nothing less." Across town, Daniel began another ordinary day before sunrise. Emma sat at the kitchen table finishing her math homework, while eating oatmeal sprinkled with cinnamon. "Daddy," she asked, looking up from her notebook, "what does opportunity mean?" Daniel poured a glass of orange juice before answering. "Opportunity is a door that opens because you prepared yourself before anyone noticed." Emma thought quietly for a moment. "So you still have to walk through it?" Daniel smiled. "Exactly." After dropping Emma at school, he returned to the garage where Mike was already laughing over the morning newspaper. "Looks like another big company is looking for a fleet repair contract," Mike said. "Too bad shops like ours never get invited." Daniel glanced briefly at the article before returning to the engine resting on his workbench. "The right work always finds the right people eventually." Mike chuckled. "You really believe that, do you not?" Daniel tightened another bolt with steady hands. "I have to. It makes showing up every morning worthwhile." Later that afternoon, an unfamiliar black sedan stopped outside the garage. A professionally dressed representative stepped inside, carrying a leather portfolio embossed with the Bennett Financial Group logo. Daniel looked up from beneath the hood of a delivery van and politely greeted the visitor. "Can I help you?" The representative smiled. "We are conducting evaluations for a long-term commercial fleet maintenance partnership. Your shop has been recommended based on customer satisfaction and workmanship. Would you be interested in participating?" Daniel exchanged a surprised glance with Mike before answering. "Of course." The representative handed him a packet explaining the inspection process, qualification standards, and interview schedule. Everything appeared transparent, competitive, and completely professional. As the sedan drove away, Daniel looked once more at the folder resting in his hands. He had no idea who had quietly placed his name before the selection committee. Miles away, standing beside her office window overlooking the Chicago skyline, Charlotte watched the same company's sedan return to headquarters. She never asked whether Daniel would win the contract. She only hoped that, for once, the world would finally recognize the extraordinary man who had spent years doing ordinary things with extraordinary integrity. The evaluation process began the following week with quiet professionalism. Representatives from Bennett Financial Group visited every repair shop on their shortlist without revealing which business they preferred. They inspected equipment, reviewed safety records, interviewed mechanics, and spoke with longtime customers waiting in reception areas. Daniel treated the visit no differently than he treated every ordinary workday. He answered each question honestly, admitted where his small garage still needed improvement, and never exaggerated his abilities. When one evaluator complimented the spotless organization of the workspace despite its age, Daniel simply smiled. "Good tools last longer when people respect them," he replied. The evaluator nodded thoughtfully before writing something in his notebook. Later that afternoon, another customer arrived with a delivery van that had broken down only hours before an important shipment. The driver apologized repeatedly, explaining that his small family business could not afford delays. Daniel carefully inspected the engine before estimating several hours of work. Seeing the worry on the driver's face, he quietly rearranged his own schedule and asked Mike to postpone a less urgent repair until the following morning. "Families are waiting on that delivery," Daniel explained. "We can stay a little later tonight." Mike looked at him with familiar amusement. "One day you are going to realize you cannot save everybody." Daniel tightened another bolt before smiling. "Maybe not. But I can help the person standing in front of me." Unknown to Daniel, two members of the evaluation committee had remained nearby after completing their inspection. Instead of leaving immediately, they watched through the office window as Daniel calmly worked beyond closing time without complaining or expecting recognition. They observed Emma sitting at a small desk in the corner of the garage, finishing her homework, while occasionally looking up to ask her father a math question. Each time, Daniel stopped what he was doing, patiently explained the problem, and returned to work with the same steady focus. One evaluator quietly remarked, "Character cannot be manufactured. It appears in moments people believe no one is watching." The other simply nodded. Across town, Charlotte received updates from the selection committee exactly as she had instructed. Every report focused on measurable performance, customer satisfaction, technical skill, and reliability. Daniel's name consistently ranked near the top, without any special treatment or hidden advantage. Reading those reports filled her with quiet satisfaction because they confirmed what she had already discovered for herself. His reputation had been built long before she entered his life. Several days later, Daniel received an invitation to present his maintenance proposal before the final review panel. He spent the evening at his kitchen table studying fleet service requirements after Emma had fallen asleep upstairs. Old engineering notebooks rested beside updated repair manuals as he carefully prepared practical ideas that could improve efficiency without increasing unnecessary costs. Looking at the pages spread across the table, he realized how much of his former career still lived quietly inside him. He had never stopped being an engineer. He had simply chosen to become the father his daughter needed most. Before turning out the kitchen light, Daniel noticed a small note Emma had left beside his coffee mug. In careful handwriting she had written, "You always tell me to do my best. Tomorrow you do your best too. I already know you are the best dad." Daniel folded the note carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket. As morning approached, he believed he was preparing for nothing more than an important business opportunity. He never imagined that the person who had quietly opened the first door was waiting just beyond the next one, ready to reveal a truth that would change both of their lives forever. The conference room overlooking downtown Chicago felt surprisingly quiet as Daniel adjusted the collar of his clean blue shirt before taking his seat across from the evaluation panel. He had polished his worn dress shoes the night before and carefully pressed the only blazer he still owned. It was not expensive, but Emma had smiled proudly when she told him he looked like the smartest engineer in the whole city. That memory stayed with him as the meeting began. The panel asked thoughtful questions about preventive maintenance, operating costs, fuel efficiency, and long-term vehicle reliability. Daniel answered each one with calm confidence born from years of practical experience rather than rehearsed speeches. He explained how small repairs completed at the right time often prevented larger expenses months later. He described maintenance not as fixing machines, but as protecting the families and workers who depended on those vehicles every day. Several members of the committee exchanged quiet glances while taking notes. They recognized genuine expertise whenever they heard it. Near the end of the presentation, the conference room door opened softly. Charlotte stepped inside carrying a folder, apologizing for arriving late after another executive meeting. Daniel looked up and immediately recognized the woman whose wallet he had returned weeks earlier. Surprise crossed his face before he politely nodded. Charlotte returned the greeting with a warm but composed smile. The remaining committee members quietly completed the final questions before thanking Daniel for his time. As they gathered their documents and left the room one by one, Charlotte remained standing beside the large window overlooking the city. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel smiled gently. "I had no idea this was your company." Charlotte gave a small nod. "I wanted to tell you sooner, but I was afraid you would think this opportunity was a reward instead of an honest evaluation." Daniel studied her expression carefully. "Was it?" Charlotte met his eyes without hesitation. "No. I made certain every qualified repair shop received exactly the same opportunity. I only insisted that your garage be included because I realized it had been overlooked before. Everything after that was earned by your own work." Daniel remained quiet as he considered her words. There was no arrogance in her voice, no attempt to purchase gratitude, only sincere respect. Charlotte slowly continued. "I followed you after you returned my wallet." Daniel looked surprised, but not offended. "I know. That sounds unusual," she admitted softly. "At first I wanted to understand why someone would refuse so much money. Then I saw how you treated your daughter, your customers, your neighbors, and complete strangers. Somewhere along the way, I stopped following a man who returned a wallet and started learning from a father who quietly lives the values my own father spent his life trying to teach me." Daniel looked toward the skyline beyond the glass before smiling with quiet humility. "I am just trying to keep the promises I made to my wife and my daughter." Charlotte reached into her folder and carefully removed the handwritten letter that had nearly been lost forever. "My father ended this letter with one sentence I never fully understood until I met you." She unfolded the page and read softly. "When you find someone whose character makes the world kinder, never try to pay them back. Simply make sure the door they deserve is finally opened." Daniel felt the small note Emma had written still resting inside his shirt pocket. He smiled gently, realizing that two fathers who had never met had somehow passed the same lesson to the people they loved most. In that quiet room high above the city, neither success nor money seemed important anymore. What mattered was that kindness had quietly found another heart willing to carry it forward. Several weeks later, the final decision arrived in a plain white envelope that looked far less impressive than the news it carried. Daniel stood inside Harper Auto Repair with Mike and Emma beside him as he carefully unfolded the letter. His eyes moved slowly across the page before he stopped reading altogether. Mike leaned closer with growing impatience. "Well," Daniel looked up with a quiet smile that spoke before any words could. "We were selected." For a brief moment, the garage became wonderfully silent. Then Emma threw her arms around her father with joyful laughter, while Mike clapped him firmly on the shoulder. "I have been waiting years for somebody to notice what you can do," Mike said proudly. Daniel simply looked around the old garage that had carried him through the hardest years of his life. The cracked concrete floor, the worn tool cabinets, and the faded walls suddenly seemed filled with new possibility. The contract would not make him wealthy overnight, but it would provide steady work, allow him to hire another mechanic, replace aging equipment, and finally begin turning long-delayed dreams into reality. Across town, Charlotte quietly reviewed the same contract after the legal department completed every final signature. She felt genuine satisfaction knowing the selection committee had reached its conclusion without pressure or favoritism. Daniel had earned every line written on those pages. A week later, she accepted an invitation to visit the garage as Bennett Financial Group officially introduced its new maintenance partner. There were no television cameras, no speeches celebrating generosity, and no public announcement about the wallet that had started everything. Daniel preferred it that way. He greeted Charlotte with the same calm respect he had shown the first day they met. "Welcome," he said warmly. "I hope we earn your trust every single day." Charlotte smiled. "I believe you already have." Emma hurried over carrying a freshly baked batch of oatmeal cookies wrapped inside a small tin decorated with colorful flowers. "These are for you," she said proudly. Charlotte accepted the gift with both hands. "Thank you. They look wonderful." Emma grinned. "Daddy says people should never celebrate important days on an empty stomach." Charlotte laughed softly before looking toward Daniel. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." He shrugged with quiet amusement. "Life has enough difficult moments. Cookies usually help." As the afternoon continued, Charlotte watched the small team work together with remarkable care. Every customer received the same attention regardless of the age of the vehicle they drove or the size of the repair bill. She noticed Daniel greeting every person by name whenever possible and thanking them sincerely before they left. Success had not changed him because success had never been the foundation of his character. Later that evening, after the final customer departed, Daniel placed a brand new sign above the garage entrance. It did not mention awards, contracts, or business achievements. It simply read, "Honesty keeps every journey moving forward." Emma smiled proudly as she helped straighten the sign while the setting sun cast a warm golden glow across the building. Charlotte stood quietly across the parking lot, realizing that the greatest transformation had not happened inside the garage at all. It had happened inside her own heart. She had begun searching for a man who returned a wallet, but along the way she rediscovered the values her father had spent a lifetime trying to teach her, and she silently promised herself that every opportunity she opened from that day forward would honor character before success, kindness before status, and integrity before profit. Nearly 1 year later, the first warm days of spring arrived, filling the neighborhood with blooming trees and the familiar sounds of children riding bicycles along quiet streets. Harper Auto Repair had changed in many visible ways. The old faded sign had been replaced, new service bays stood beside the original garage, and several young mechanics now worked alongside Daniel, each one carefully learning not only how to repair engines, but also how to treat every customer with honesty and respect. Yet despite the growth, one thing had never changed. Daniel still arrived before sunrise to unlock the front door himself, brew the first pot of coffee, and greet every person with the same quiet smile that had carried him through years when success seemed far away. Emma, now a little taller and just as cheerful, often finished her homework at the small desk that still remained in the corner of the garage. Daniel refused to remove it because, as he liked to say, every good future deserved a place where it first began. One peaceful Saturday afternoon, after closing the garage early, Daniel and Emma stopped at the same supermarket where everything had quietly started nearly a year before. While returning their shopping cart, Emma noticed a small leather wallet resting beside the curb. "Daddy," she called gently, holding it carefully with both hands. Daniel looked at the wallet for a brief moment before smiling. What do you think we should do? Emma answered without hesitation. Find the owner. Daniel nodded proudly. That sounds exactly right. Standing only a short distance away, Charlotte had witnessed the entire moment while loading groceries into her car. She watched as Emma carefully protected the wallet exactly the way Daniel once had, and she realized that kindness had already become something far greater than a single decision. It had become an inheritance passed from one generation to the next. Daniel looked through the identification just long enough to locate the owner's address before placing the wallet safely inside his truck. He never checked how much money was inside because he no longer needed proof that doing the right thing was always worthwhile. Charlotte quietly walked over with a warm smile. Some traditions are worth keeping, she said softly. Daniel smiled back. I was hoping Emma would make this choice on her own. Emma looked up at both of them with innocent curiosity. Why would anyone choose differently? Neither adult answered immediately because neither could improve upon the simple wisdom of a child. Charlotte glanced toward the bright spring sky before quietly unfolding her father's letter one last time. The paper had grown softer with age, but the final sentence remained as clear as ever. The world changes one honest choice at a time. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside her wallet, knowing it had finally found the life it was always meant to guide. As Daniel, Emma, and Charlotte drove toward another ordinary afternoon, there were no cheering crowds, no headlines, and no applause. The greatest stories rarely announced themselves that way. They lived quietly inside ordinary people who chose kindness when no one was watching, dignity when no reward was guaranteed, and grace when life offered every excuse to choose otherwise. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not the money someone returns or the opportunity someone receives. Sometimes the greatest miracle is discovering that one honest decision can inspire another, then another, until hope quietly begins traveling farther than anyone ever imagined, changing hearts long before it changes the world.